The reading for our sermon today is taken from the Gospel of Thomas. This is verse 96. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like the dough in which a woman has hidden some yeast. It becomes transformed into good bread." As you know, I've had some experiences with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I like them. What I find really compelling is that they are utterly convinced, I would say as I am, mostly, that this is how I want to live. And they want to share that message. And I was recently watching on Netflix this show called The Family. And The Family apparently, well, not apparently, The Family is a documentary about this Christian secretive group that exists in Hollywood. That's not Hollywood, sorry, in Washington. And for many, many decades, this group has always included the highest performing politicians, the presidents, the senators, the congressmen, whatever. And they have these prayer breakfasts, and the story, the first episode began with this guy who was a reporter, and he wanted to find out what this was all about, so he got involved with it. And it's a reenactment of, this men's house where these guys live together and they're following the teachings of Christ. And there's a lot of similarities to the order that I was trained in, because I started to live with the people. And the one guy who is the reporter is taking it all in. He's taking notes, he's asking questions. And there's other guys about his age that are utterly convinced that Jesus wants you to do this and Jesus wants you to do that. The tone of the documentary is always a little bit like, once in a while the music changes and you wonder, is this all some big manipulative cult? And I didn't watch too many episodes just because it wasn't that interesting to me at some point. But again, here are people that are very convinced that this is how you're supposed to do it. This is the way. And here's the one guy, the reporter, kind of like, what do? And I want to be accepted. And he goes like, these are really cool elements, and I really felt loved and kind treatment by these guys. And then, there were times when something happened and made me go, well, is this weird? And one of the things about this group is they believe some people are chosen for leadership by God. And if you are chosen by God to be like a political leader, then you're in a certain type of elite category. And they'll point to the scripture that says, many are called, but few are chosen. And so they're very convinced that they are the chosen. And as a result, there's really nothing anybody can do. They are destined to be in power positions. And it's not that they want to abuse that power, but they believe that some are chosen and some are not. And they are chosen. Okay, so is that correct or not? It's hard to know, because there are times when the energy doesn't feel right to me, based on my training. But I don't have to do anything about it. The point that I want to make is that I think everybody, to a certain degree, anybody who's drawn towards any kind of spirituality, and especially if we focus on Christianity, there's literally thousands of denominations. If you think about, the Baptist church, is that a church that's built upon the idea of baptism? Baptism is the beginning of a spiritual quest. It's kind of like we mostly think of it as, I'm going to get dunked in water, which is symbolic of cleansing myself of the past. Okay, and then what? Like, what happens after baptism? So it's a little intriguing to me. I never really thought about it. I was meditating today and going, why would you call your whole church Baptist? John the Baptist was not the end all. It's like he was preparing the way for Christ. So maybe that's what they thought. Now, if I talk to somebody who's been in the Baptist church, they might be able to give me an answer, and I would be open to hearing it. Then you have Methodist church. Well, that sounds like there's a method. What is the method? Doesn't every church have a method to a certain degree? Presbyterian, well, that comes from the Greek word for priest. So a priest-centric church, I don't know. Lutheran, based on the teachings of Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, but another guy. So I really believe that we are all trying to figure this out. We are all trying to go. For those of us who want God and want to live in accord with love, we're trying to figure it out. So first and foremost, our group is going to accept all of that. We're not out there proclaiming superiority. The beautiful thing about the mystical church, though, and I'm not talking about the mystical church of Christ / Charleston, I'm talking about anybody who ascribes to a mystical path, is that we are going to know from our own experience. We are going beyond believing. Now, you will have many experiences on the path, and those experiences leave you with knowledge, right? If you put your hand on a hot stove and it burns and it takes you 2 weeks for it to heal, you know something. And no amount of convincing can tell you that if you put your hand on the stove, it's not going to burn. You're going to go like, I've been through it, I've suffered the healing, you cannot tell me that I should believe to put my hand on, right? That's very basic. And every week at our Bible class, we seek to have a transformative experience. We seek to know something that we didn't know. And I find that it happens a lot. It happens for me. I see it happening in others. Of course, 2 days later, where is that knowledge? Are the doubts and the fears coming back? So there's a challenge, right? Because we have to really clock in those experiences and let them build upon themselves so that we actually know that we are on a path of transformation. I mean, isn't it true for those of you who've been coming around for a certain number of months that you don't see things the way you used to? You can't. Your sight has been opened. So if you used to think of your parents this way and then you go and hang out with them and you hear how they speak and how they think and how they live, you didn't see it before, probably. It's not that it's good or it's bad. I mean, you can see if it's life-affirming. You can see if it's obsessed with a certain type of fear or anxiety. I mean, you can see that. We're not asking you to judge it, but I do want you to see it. And how is that possible that you could see something that for 30 years you couldn't see? Well, you've had a transformative experience. And that's why the mystical path to me works. That's why I do it. Because I can very concretely say, I know things that before I didn't know. I see things that I didn't used to see. I can feel truth when before I tried to fudge truth. I wanted truth to be what I wanted. And now I'm more comfortable recognizing truth even if it's not what I want. Yeah, when the truth is what you want, oh my God, the angels are singing on high. What a beautiful thing. When the truth is not what you want, there's a battle. Do I accept it or do I fight against it? And my mind wants to go, well, we could read it this way, and we could twist it, and then we can finally go, oh, that actually is what I want. But the Christ consciousness strives to show you only what is, that which is truly there. And then our task is to be able to recognize it and not embellish it with our emotional preferences, not let our fears overwhelm us so that we have to corrupt reality, we have to twist it to the thing that we want it to be. Now we have an interesting teaching this morning in the parable. This is another beautiful thing. You know, some people might go like, why doesn't God just tell us what it is so we don't have to have the 22,000, denominations? And then the Jehovah's Witnesses and the, Mormon Latter-day Saints and all these people can all go, oh, we were sort of right here and we were sort of wrong there, and actually what it is this. There's no way for God to do that. I mean, have you ever told somebody just as clear as day something and you just watch them go, yeah, maybe. They're not prepared to take your guidance or your advice. I mean, even if it's not something that you're that emotionally invested in, it's just kind of like, dude, anybody could see that, this is not working out. Well, maybe it's not, maybe it is. There's an element of the human being that is very stubborn. And it will relinquish when it's ready. Okay. God created us where we have that option. That's called love. If you have to relinquish before you're ready, that's not love. So to a certain degree, your system, if it's in angst, is not ready to relinquish that struggle because it probably doesn't trust love. Why doesn't it trust love? Because love has betrayed you. There have been times where you've received love and you started to relax and you started to go, okay, this is good, and then boom. That person who was loving you changes the rules. So we become very cautious, and our system begins to, sort of be very, very vigilant about, is it okay to relax? Is it okay to trust? Now think about what happens in the passage, right? The kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, is like the ball of dough that has been, that yeast has been added to it. I would like to think of yourselves, I'd like to think of ourselves as that kind of raw ball of dough. Now when you put yeast into it, what happens? Well, those of you who ever baked bread, let's forget about the baking first of all. The flour is this sort of raw ingredient that can sit on the shelf for quite some time. But it contains these two different types of proteins. I was reading about this morning. When the water goes in, that allows the proteins to now get to know each other. And what's really quite intriguing, because I'm going to share with you the whole gluten thing, is very interesting. The two proteins actually form gluten. There's one called gluteneous and the other is like glutinous or something. They're like both gluten-ish sounding names. You know about this. Then when you put the water in, those two react in a chemical way. I guess the water facilitates a communication, and they form gluten. The world is becoming very, very intolerant of gluten. My system is not very tolerant of gluten. Metaphorically, to me, that's an indication that, to a certain degree, we are all becoming a little less open to God. Now, how did that happen? I mean, we should be able to eat glutinous products. Well, the best that I can understand is that, corporations went, we need to create a wheat that has greater longevity because the breads are, they're molding too fast. So what if we do this and this chemically? And they find a way to make the wheat strain more resilient or more long. But what's the cost? The cost is there's always a side effect. This is why pharmaceuticals to me are risky unless you absolutely need them, is that they fix one thing, but they mess up another. And so after years and years, our systems, which were made to be able to process the proper gluten, now because they have messed with it, we can't. Many of us can't. So we've developed all these breads that aren't made in the traditional way. But you'll hear in the Bible a lot of talk about the bread of life. So first of all, we put the yeast in, which is a fungus. Right? The yeast is a fungus, which what happens is, okay, first of all, the water allows for the two proteins to begin to create gluten, and the yeast begins to feed off of the sugars, and so it starts to expand. Now imagine that the Christ force in you, which is trying to be introduced into your dough, the dough of your life, your consciousness, now begins to create a chemical response. And there's an expansion. We call that stretching. That's when you're stretched on the path in ways that create pressure inside. I mean, if you ever had an injury and it starts to swell, you can almost get this close to it, and it's like it's painful. Because there's such sensitivity when there's that swelling. And this is something that happens as you surrender to the path and you invite the yeast of the Christ to affect the dough of your life. Things expand, and your ability to give and to love is being stretched. That's why it's painful. If we didn't know this, we might go like, what's going on? I don't feel good. Yeah, because you're kind of, you could say you're being forced to expand, but you wanted it. Remember that. When you make the bread, we want the bread. We want the end result. But what's going on inside of the dough is kind of violent in a way. So that's the first thing I want you to be aware of, is that the Christ consciousness is like the yeast that is going to create expansion within. And that expansion, until you're used to it and can relax, is going to be like a stretching, that it opens your capacity for greater spiritual experience. So it's quite normal for that to feel unsettling. Now you thought that was unsettling, now we're going to put it in the oven. Now it's really amazing what happens when you put water and flour and yeast in the oven. Because the various molecules react at different temperatures. And specific things start to happen. I mean, I wish I could define it step by step. I didn't have enough time to study it, and I don't know enough about science. But, you know, at certain temperatures, these things kind of burst into it's like there's caramelizing of sugar, but that doesn't happen until 356 degrees Fahrenheit. And, you know, how is it that these molecules are programmed to respond at a particular temperature? I mean, that's where you just got to go, God is amazing. So that what ends up happening is that there's this tremendous pressure, because imagine, you know, if you're in this oven and this heat is trying to bring you to a place where you are really, really edible and you know, the good bread, as Jesus says. If you're that dough, you're probably going like, what is going on? This is horrible. The heat is crazy, and I'm being stretched and expanded and caramelized and all this stuff. And eventually removed, and it's that, you know, nice, soft, squishy dough with the crust and the golden brown, and it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a little sad that the whole carb movement has made bread kind of the enemy, because good breads are awesome. But we're going through that process. Why? Because you said you wanted it. You want truth, you want life. Remember I said, everyone's out there trying to figure it out. Well, what I have figured out is that the truth is, we are to be transformed into the good bread, so that we may be food for those who are not yet ready for it. And people might go, well, that doesn't sound, I mean, it sounds kind of good, but what about me? Yeah, well, that's the problem, right? We don't realize that in order to get there, you are going to be transformed, and whatever it is that's troubling you is going to be healed. So you commit to becoming the good bread. And along the way, you know, the priest helps you correct all the little things that are preventing you from being the good bread. But ultimately what's happening is that the consciousness of the Christ is the yeast. It's creating chemical reactions that are stretching you, making you fluffier. Then you're put in the oven and you're subjected to intense transformative heat, the fire of God. And not everybody can handle it, I suppose. So that's okay, we don't force it. But what happens when you take the bread out of the oven when it's only half done? I mean, it's really not that inedible. I mean, you could eat it. But staying in the oven and trusting and having the faith that that pressure and that heat is going to have to reach a certain point before there's dramatic transformation. You know, I mean, are you going to hang in there until the molecules inside hit 356 degrees? And the sugars reach this particular point, and the yeast responds with the gluten, and boom. You actually, you know, what's interesting too is it's hard to know. You can look at bread and go, well, the outside looks done. You know, I got decent hairdo. You know, relatively thin. But the inside, we don't know if it's done, right? It's kind of hard to know. I mean, you can poke it with some, you know, sharp sticks, and you hope, you know, we pull out anything that shows us it's not done. But it's kind of hard to know. Well, who knows? Well, there's going to be somebody with experience that can go, not done yet. You know, those are the priests. The priests who have watched enough times to be able to go, just hold on, I know you want to get out of there and you want to be the good bread, but let's make sure we are the good bread. Let's be a little bit more patient. And this is where we develop faith. You know, we develop faith in the priest, in the teachings, in the Christ within. But not that pleasant of a process to be in the oven. There is a teaching where Jesus goes, I mean, he talks about how after you've worked all day in the field and you are called in to the master's house, do you sit down and do you have dinner with the master? No. Yes, you have worked all day, but you make the food for the master and you serve the master, and when the master is done, then you sit down and eat. And some people might go like, man, really? I mean, when's it end? But he ends the teaching with a beautiful line that always actually is, it's sort of like, to me, one of the t-shirt slogans for Mind Ministry, which is it not what you ought to do? And I like the difference between ought and should. It's a very subtle thing, because people don't like the word should. You know, if he said like, well, that's what you should do, there's a kind of a tone about that. It's really subtle, because I was sort of trying to tune into it. Is it really any different? But when he says, is it not what you ought to do? To me, there's much more choice in that. And what he's saying is, it could be a simple choice to make it your duty to become the good bread and not question it every 10 minutes because it's hard. I mean, we're going to question it at times because not everybody is choosing to become the good bread. So we might, there's part of us that goes like, well, here I am, doing all the work, and look at this guy, he's out there getting wasted, and look at this guy, he's out there picking up women, and look at this woman, she's out there finding a trophy husband and spending all this money, and why am I doing this? Imagine Jesus whispering, is it not what you ought to do? And you go, that does resonate, you. So when it resonates, let's say that that's what it means to be chosen. It resonates. Something about it goes, yeah, I could pursue all these other worldly things, and I probably have, but is this not what I ought to be doing? And there's a real piece that goes, all right, I accept it. Put me in the oven, crank it up, and let's become the good bread.